Yes, good evening, everyone. Here at the Institute and those who are attending us online, my name is Michael Kwakkelstein, and as the director, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Bette Talvacchia, our speaker this evening and for 3 other evenings. Bette Talvacchia is a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Art History, Emerita, the University of Connecticut. Bette Talvacchia holds a PhD in art history from Stanford University. Her work as a scholar focuses on the art and culture of the Italian Renaissance and on issues of sexuality and gender. Her present research has expanded to include investigation of the continuity between historical art and the modern contemporary tradition. Dr. Talvacchia's books include Taking Positions on the Erotic in Renaissance Culture, that was published in 1999 by Princeton University Press, the book on monograph of Raphael, that's Phaidon Press, London 2007, A Cultural History of Sexuality in the Renaissance, that was published by Berg Publishers, Oxford 2011, and the 2 Michelangelos, published recently 2021 by Lund Humphreys, which was honored as a Choice Outstanding academic title in 2023. Congratulations again. Together, Betty and I, we edited the volume around Antonella da Messina in our NIKI studies of Netherlands and Italian art history, that were conference proceedings of a conference you organized as scholarly resident here. And that was published in 2014, to which you also contributed a paper, of course, a paper she delivered during the conference. Dr. Talvacchia has been a fellow, a guest, a scholar, and Robert Lehman visiting professor at Villa I Tatti. That's the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. She has held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Center for Advanced Study in Visual Arts at the National Gallery, Washington, D.C., and at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in, I don't know when.
I don't remember.
No, you don't remember. Well, in New York, during all these dates, during 2011 and 12, she was the scholar in residence here at our institute, the first scholar in residence since the renovation here. And at the start of her career, she was a Fulbright Fellow in Rome. Dr. Talvacchia has given talks in many locations throughout the United States, Italy, and England, as well as the Museum for Western Art in Tokyo, that's in Japan. An enthusiastic, passionate public speaker, she engages with diverse audiences on a wide range of topics, an initiative that has become an important part of Dr. Talvacchia's professional profile. The National Endowment for the Humanities awarded Dr. Talvacchia a fellowship as part of its inaugural Public Scholars Program in 2015 and 16. Most recently, she has presented a course at the New York Public Library entitled The Other Renaissance, Gender and Sexuality in Renaissance Art. But now we're here, you're here, and we are very pleased and honored to have you back after all this time. And this time, you will deliver this series of 4 talks. And the first talk this evening is called Incorporation, as part of the series of talks entitled Common Ground, Explorations of Contemporary Art Through a Renaissance Lens. Betty, the floor goes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael, for such a lovely introduction. And what I want to do is really have a conversation with everyone this evening, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So thanks to everyone for showing up here. Hello to everyone online. And I'm going to do this in this more conversational way, because really this is work in progress. And I want to share the basic idea with everyone as I'm developing it, and of course get reactions and see what happens, if it's convincing. Because in many ways, this is a personal project that began because of my background, having done my master's thesis on Balla and Futurism, and then going on to do my PhD in Renaissance art. And although I went forward really as a specialist in Renaissance material, I never lost my love or my interest for modern art and then into, of course, contemporary art, because I've always felt that as I study history, it's also important to be very linked to my own culture. And so finally, I've decided to bring those two things together, a kind of hybrid personality or research, to bring them together, because in my process of looking at contemporary art in particular in galleries and museums, I would, of course, notice immediately if there was any connection or reference to the historical tradition, and just note it on my own. And I was surprised that very often this was not indicated in any of the comments or the criticism or the scholarship. And eventually this began to add up. And when we came to the point of finding an attitude where historical art doesn't really count anymore, and that in order to make room for a wider range of art, which of course we're all, I think, in favor of, that somehow that has to push out historical art. And I, through my process of looking, knew that some of the best artists working now and working in the 20th century were very involved with historical art. So I've picked out just the ones who concentrated on Renaissance art, or I've taken just examples from that moment to try to be very focused in making this point about continuity through time. Now, I've been able to do this because there has developed a very intrepid and really talented group of curators in museums who are starting to who've been putting on very exciting exhibitions that trace some of these threads that go through time. And of course, the gallerists who show art from upcoming artists, from artists who have been perhaps ignored in the past. And again, from my point of view, as someone living in New York, I am just always thrilled to have access to such a variety of art constantly that's just put there for all of us to look at. I mean, aside from other concerns, of course, of having the gallery go on, but we're welcomed in anytime we want to be there. The staff will talk with us. Often the directors will talk with us. So this is a thank you to those curators, to the gallerists, and also then to the New York Public Library, because you can imagine the range of material I've been looking at is quite vast. And when I began to put this together systematically, I then needed to get my hands on material very quickly, which of course I could do to some extent on the internet, going to museum and gallery sites. But since I'm doing this historically, when I wanted to look back in history or look at the fuller view of the artist, I would go to the NYPL, and they have such vast resources. They put this material in my hands immediately. And so that's another institution that I'd like to recognize as a kind of partner in this project. Then, of course, there's NIKI. That itself is a hybrid institution. I mean, we're doing a hybrid talk now. I've said I'm a hybrid in terms of my background, and NIKI has dropped down from the Netherlands right into Florence. And so here we have this meeting of research on historical art, and also coming from a country where there's such fervent and creative activity in contemporary design. And so I see this as a perfect place. And Director Michael Kwakkelstein, one of the few people who would have been open to a presentation of this sort. So I appreciate that very much, and will add, I hope, to the positive aspect of all of these hybrids coming together. So let me just now say a word or two about how I'm going to approach this. And it's going to be very visual with lots of material and then a few comments about each comparison that I make. And if in the end you feel that I haven't said enough, or if you know that I've left an artist out that you really like, that for me is a positive outcome, because it indicates that there's so much more to say about each individual that I've included, and also for all of the artists I haven't been able to include, just in terms of organizing this series of talks. So I'm dedicating this series to all of the artists who I've included in the presentations, because they have stayed very committed to their own visions, even at points when they were doing things, say in the earlier 20th century and at times today, that are not so trendy or critically acceptable, but they forged ahead and have given us this amazing body of art that shows them using their artistic legacy. They're the inheritors of all of this historical art, and often their interest in that and their use of it will just give us fantastic results. So this theme is really a basis of response to the notion that things are so fragmented that there's not a continuity with the art today and the past. And I'm hoping that I'm going to give some ideas to counter that. Also, you will notice that in the 4 categories I've made up, I have not used the word appropriation, and I will not use that in a descriptive way at all in any of the 4 talks. I'd like to give some alternatives to that term and see if they're convincing about ways of viewing a particular development in art. And I've done this because the term appropriation to me has always seemed pejorative in the way it sounds in English. It's something you steal, it's something you take that maybe you shouldn't, or you've taken it aggressively. And I'm going to try to put that to the side and see if these other categories that I suggest might work to show continuity, rather than that sense of stealing something, taking it as your own in a way that's maybe less than honorable. So those 4 terms happen to be incorporation. That's where we start. And that is when artists really just quote something from the past. They'll use it in all different sorts of ways, but an absolutely recognizable use of something that exists in historical art. And then continuation, where I've looked at the materials that artists can use that were used in the past. And let's just say fresco or mosaic, that are not thought of as much as being a force in the contemporary tradition. But I think, again, it'll be surprising that sometimes that link is forged through the materiality of the objects made. Then we have variation. And that is when you can see what theme or what individual work of art or what subject has been used, but it's been given a variation in a way that is often extremely clever. There can be all different kinds of reactions to this dialogue that I see as being set up. It can be serious, it can be teasing, it can be tongue-in-cheek or a little, what should we say, it could be maybe supplanting what came before a little bit, but all those different voices still start from the acknowledgement of a conversation, let's say, with an artist or a work of art from the past. And then the final one is transformation, where, again, there is a very definite reference to historical art, but it has been changed in a way that has to do very much with our own time and place, or with the specific interest of the artist who made the work. So that's an overview of what the 4 talks will present. And I think these dialogues that artists have engaged can be very, very energizing for a very then specific new, innovative, contemporary way of speaking, let's say, through visual elements. I think I read somewhere this wonderful sort of pithy statement that contemporary art exists. It does not exist in a historical vacuum. There is a context for art of today, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And what I'm also going to argue is that when we look at the canonic sort of construction of the movement toward modernism, of course, we're going to read about the throwing over of Renaissance art and the progressive movement toward abstraction and then non-objectivity. Well, that is certainly one path, but I think you'll be surprised that at times even artists who work in abstract styles make very specific references to their Renaissance predecessors. And I'd like to say that when an artist decides not to use an illusionistic perspective, that happens quite a lot in the modern tradition, but that does not mean that it rejects all of the Renaissance. That's just one technical aspect. And I would say that is the one that is most often changed in terms of the new stylistic developments. But I think it's very narrow-minded to say that if that rational space does not exist, there's an absolute refutation of everything the Renaissance stood for. So I'm going to try to broaden that and to say, okay, we can have non-illusionistic space, but let's see what else is there. All right, I'm just sneaking looks at my notes. I'm supposed to stand still here, but I'm staying on the X. But anyway, let me make sure I don't leave anything out. So again, why am I doing this? Well, yes, for my own satisfaction and enjoyment. I'm trying now to make it more systematic. And also, I think that knowing both traditions makes a reading of each of these different kinds of art more rewarding, richer, gives us more to think about. And I think it works both ways, that those of us who know the Renaissance much, much better than we know modern art benefit by seeing what an artist might have done, and it makes us rethink what we've always known about the Renaissance tradition. And then, of course, by the same token, if we look at, let's say we're not so conversant with contemporary art and some of it leaves us a bit confused, if there's a handle that shows this continuity, it may then more easily open up our enjoyment, understanding, appreciation, and involvement with our own art. So I really hope that it goes both ways. As I gathered this material, something very interesting began to happen. And that is that I was sort of collecting information about artists who had been underrepresented, both in the literature and in the museums of the past. And again, you're going to see a lot of that art, a lot of women, a lot of artists of color, some Asian and African artists. And this was something that made itself clear as I went along. I didn't start with that premise, but as I explored the art, this is where I was finding quite a lot of it. And it began to make sense that what was privileged was narration, figural elements, often portraiture. And these groups wanted to use art, and still want to, as a vehicle for telling their stories, often explicitly and very clearly articulated in statements that they made to give their community more of a representation, visibility. And that became a very exciting part of what I was looking at. And so that's something that will come up again and again. So as we think of, yes, there was a movement toward abstraction and non-objectivity, at the same time, there was a parallel history being created, and it just has not been as much followed or documented or integrated into a larger history of modernism. So my final hope is that what I've been trying to put together might be one little slice, one little contribution to this larger history that many people are beginning to look into and to write about and to articulate. And that is something that would be, again, a very positive outcome to make some small contribution to engaging not so much an alternative, but just a parallel path of modernism. All right, so that rather long introduction, I hope will hold for all of the talks, because what I want to do now is get into the material itself. All right, that was our beginning. So I'm going to use Philip Guston as a sort of overall symbol and statement of this connection, because Philip Guston is, I'm imagining, an artist you might not associate with the style of the Renaissance. And in fact, the style doesn't really have anything to do with it. But as you see in that painting, where he makes a proclamation, and it's really an unexpected, when I first saw it, it was quite unexpected, that he just lists, it's like he screams the names of his heroes. Masaccio, maybe I should do it more in order, Giotto, Masaccio, Piero because Piero maybe isn't such a household word, but of course it's Della Francesca, so he's also teasing us a little bit. And he goes into later history with Tiepolo and then De Chirico. And of course, these are all Italian artists, and they are all artists who were masters of narrative. And I think that that certainly was one of the things that interested Guston. You might know a little bit of his history. I put a few of his works there to show you just this moment when he notoriously, almost infamously, switched his allegiance, is how it was seen, from abstract expressionism into figural art. And you can imagine in the 70s, it was scandalous. You know, he broke rank with his comrades. He, you know, threw over the modernist tradition and so on and so forth. But this is how rigid that line of development, you had to adhere to it. So he, at a certain point, said, well, no, really, I don't. He wanted to tell stories. He wanted to deal with the figure. I think he also wanted to engage his own symbolic system, which if you start studying his art, you'll see he uses these soles of shoes, cigarettes, different things over and over, his personal symbols. And of course, he looked to the Renaissance masters for how that could be effective, what that could do, even if he was then working in a style that formally did not have a lot to do with them. And, you know, had I suggested that without his proclamation, there might have been a lot of, well, maybe. But I mean, as you might know, he spent a lot of time in Italy, and he was then committed to the kind of art he could make in that tradition, even in a modernist style. And I love the fact that what you're seeing there in an abstract kind of a funky design, the easel with the bare canvas on it. It's going to stand for his work. And then within that, the light bulb hanging down. You know, I was just checking, that is the emoji that comes up when you say idea. And so his ideas are there front and center. So we get this mix of even Prussian, an emoji in the front of the painting statement that these are the artists I admire and I follow, and then there's my result. Okay, so let me show you some of the history that I've reconstructed in terms of this incorporation. Okay, that first was a proclamation. It's the only one of its kind that I know about. But here we have the incorporation. So Joseph Cornell, you might know about his shadow boxes that had so much impact on younger artists. And you see two of them here who give you Renaissance figures as the central characters of the boxes he put together. And their history is very complicated in terms of what ideas he let us know about that went into making these. His shadow boxes were meant to, again, sort of tell stories that would come from your emotions. You would look at these and fill in what was happening. It came from his own personal symbolic world. And he was a Christian Scientist, and some critics have looked into the philosophy connected with that and made it part of what's behind the shadow boxes. But what, of course, I want to focus on is that he took over a couple of or several Renaissance paintings to make these. And I have to say that the first I came across the title that he gave to one of them, the Medici slot machine, I just thought everyone has to know that title if they don't already, because of course he was working at a time when these machines into which you would put coins and all different kinds of things could come out that, you have them on the street. You could buy, let's say, cigarettes way back in the old days, or other kinds of things that were sold to you in the machines. Of course, there's gambling that happens with the slot machines. So he, again, is in a tongue-in-cheek way putting together these elements, and as I think it's one of the best titles ever given to a work of art. So we get the Medici slot machines, and let me get you a little bit closer so that most of the references you undoubtedly know, but you might be wondering why Sofonisba Anguissola's painting of Massimiliano Stampa is called a Medici member of the Medici family. And that's because in the 1930s, I think it was 1939, a history of the Medici was published that had a lot of, let's say, kind of romantic ideas. It was more an individual's response to legends than what we might call standard history. But Cornell read this and was very influenced by it. So he used that attribution of that young man being a Medici prince. You have Giuliano de' Medici in there. Maybe that was supposed to be his father. Of course, he did choose Bronzino's Via dei Medici, so he has an echt Medici princess in there. And the Pinturicchio, there's an idea of these young people getting together. And in fact, in the 4 boxes, he focuses on children. So the idea of rebirth in the Renaissance, with children coming into the world and giving new life and new opportunities, was very much part of it. And let's see what else I want to look a little better. There's some blue and red balls down there, which of course are the palle of the Medici. So he has a mixture of absolute references to history with some of his own ideas. What you see in that floor plan behind Massimiliano is of the Roman Forum. And so here we are in the early 40s. Cornell was making some comparisons to fascism and to histories of the past. And so these really are full of engaging allusions that he wanted people to sort of work on their own responses to them. And as I've mentioned, that these artists often were written out of history. Of course, Cornell has had many, many studies, but he's often referred to as an outsider. He was a recluse that didn't belong to the mainstream. And recent research is showing that's absolutely not true. Of all many friends, he was friends with Marcel Duchamp. So here we have, one of the godfathers of modern tendencies of a certain kind. And this idea of putting all these different objects together and evoking thoughts and so forth, of course, was part of surrealism. And although Cornell didn't like, apparently, that association put onto his art. I mean, certainly it was there. And I think the first time he exhibited in the Julian Levy Gallery, it was within a group of surrealists. So his art was very much of the moment. And as we'll see, he did influence and had friendships with a lot of artists, and especially then a group of younger ones. So we want to revisit that idea of Cornell as someone who was marginalized in reality. He's been marginalized more in the approaches to his work and history. Okay, and also his procedure of gathering reproductions, what we might call, so, pieces of junk, worthless material. That's the very modern and contemporary idea that you make art out of what other people have gotten rid of. So that also is part of infusing that quotation of the Renaissance in a style of his own time. Okay, so I mentioned impact on younger artists, of course, much more to say, but he was sought out by Robert Rauschenberg. And Rauschenberg and he became good friends, had an interesting series of interactions, apparently. And one of the things, of course, that Rauschenberg went on to do was to make his combines. And you can see where those shadow boxes would have a lot of influence on those eventual combines. But even before that, the idea of assemblage certainly would have been enriched by what Rauschenberg knew of Cornell's work. And you can see the result in this Love Hotel anagram, a pun, all of that title from Rauschenberg himself. I'll let you meditate on all the meanings there. But Love Hotel, of course, is a kind of joking reference to hotel rooms that you rent by the hour for pleasurable activity. And so he thought that the Bronzino allegory of love was a nice reference to, again, show his interest and respect for past art, but now in a teasing way to put it in his contemporary reference to these more salacious images of love and eroticized images. So he is enjoying that reference. So I kind of messed up his image by giving you that blue arrow, but I wanted to be sure it's a little hard to read in its smaller dimensions. And I will be mentioning Leonardo often, as is proper here at NIKI, with an expert on Leonardo here sitting with us. When Rauschenberg traveled in Italy as a young artist in the early 50s, together with Cy Twombly, by the way, they made studies of all kinds of art that they encountered, and both of them had a great interest and respect for Renaissance art. And here we get some more incorporation of Mona Lisa into this collage that was made during his travels, and then a much larger canvas with in that transfer technique that he invented and perfected, maybe not invented, but all kinds of interesting ways of transferring images so that you could use many sources together. And once again, the Mona Lisa is there in currency. Of course, we can all think even more now than in the 50s of that connection between the image of the Mona Lisa and commodification and making money in tourism and so forth. So again, there's a rich reading where this is not an erudite connection, but something still provocative to make us think about the place of these masterpieces, in quotes, in contemporary culture. And now moving to a very different artist, Audrey Flack, who is still working today. I'm sorry. She just died in June. That's right. She's one of the artists who passed since I started working on this. And so my first thing, she was still working up to the end. And you might know her best as a photorealist. She had very many different styles in her long and very active career. She was a first wave feminist. And so in the 70s, including images that had to do with polemics, trying to put women artists forward and making comments on women's place in society in a larger way. And when you look at her Leonardo's Lady, you know, she's reworking, of course, the vanitas theme there, but she's doing it with objects that are thought of, you know, as feminine, in quotes, right? The pink rose, cosmetics. She painted this photorealist style apparently in acrylic with an oil on top of it. So she got very interesting surfaces. And again, this is a giant canvas. So you know you're not looking at a photo because of the dimensions of it, but she's playing with that style. And if you go back and read criticism of these artists, of this small group of photorealists, she was really the only woman in the core group. Her work was treated rather more roughly than the others. And, you know, again, we hope that people think about that and look into reasons for it. But when we see her work from 2022, she's still thinking of Leonardo and quotes the angel from The Virgin of the Rocks. Here we've got something that's a little more open-ended, immortal. Picasso's Crying Woman is sort of coming out of the head of the angel. So again, I'm not that suggestive for everyone to think about, but a fantasy style. But as I say, still saying that there's something there in that Leonardo that I want to refer to, that I want to think about, that I want you, the audience, to think about. And I promised I was going to go very quickly. So while you want to hear more about Audrey Flack, let me move on to Chris O, who is, I would say he's probably approaching mid-career at this point. Someone who was an artist who was born in Portland, Oregon, and is now working in Queens, New York. And what Chris O has done in so many variations is to rethink Renaissance compositions, giving them entirely new and unexpected supports. So here you see him repainting. So he's not reproducing really, he is painstakingly painting again an image that he has chosen. You'll see that he's particularly interested in Netherlandish art and in Florentine art that has looked to the Netherlands. So again, very appropriate to be shown at NIKI. And the Renaissance painting by Lorenzo di Credi is at the Metropolitan Museum. I put in quotes the reference to Ginevra dei Benci with a question mark, because now the consensus is it's not another portrait of her, but it's Lorenzo di Credi within about a dozen years after Leonardo's work, using those conventions of the Ginevra bush behind the woman. So we're pretty sure that's her name. In the hand, that Met tells us that on the back of that painting, someone in probably the 1500s wrote that name. So that's why the reference has to be thought about. So a very interesting painting that I hope more will be looked into about her. But Chris O takes her and repaints her on this piece of metal using those slashes to work with the image. It's almost like another kind of nature that's surrounding her. He is very much involved with thinking about not only his relationship to masters of the past, because of course, as we know, in the workshop tradition, you would start by copying your masters, and that was a way of learning. It was an act of homage. And I think that Chris O keeps those historical references in mind as he works. But by finding these different supports, he then rethinks the original work thoroughly. And in something like Hollows, where he takes the Hans Balding Green, he puts it on a piece of burnt wood and leaves the hollow where the young woman's body is. So again, as you look at it, the surface that he's worked on before he repaints that image is something where you think about art and nature. It's almost a kind of spooky effect that goes really well with the theme of the three ages of women and mortality and so forth that Balding Green had given us originally. And I'm going to give you a few more examples of his work because it just is so rich and varied. But he did many takes on Roger van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross. The crying woman that you see on the upper left is on a piece of agate, highly polished agate. And then the image below it, I had to write this down because it's complicated, but really interesting to know that chasm. He painted it on what is called a septarian nodule. And that is stones that were organic fossils devoured by bacteria and replaced with calcite. Astounding. So I think it was important to say that because he uses that and the cracks in it and so forth to emphasize this sense of grieving and near death and swooning and so forth. So again, these materials that are so unsuspected are chosen with enormous care. And I'm going to give you one final close-up of the crying figure from van der Weyden and her face repainted on the inside of the shell. So that mother of pearl, again, even with, you see on her cheek, the irregular surface becomes part of that, the way tears can sort of ravage your face. And once more, just full of rich motives to think about as you re-experience that work. Okay, leaving Creusot, I'll introduce Kehinde Wiley, who's an artist who is probably the best known of the contemporary artists I'm going to mention. And his corpus so far, I mean, he's still very much at work. And he thinks of new ways to use, especially Renaissance art, to give visibility to the people of color, to African Americans in particular in his community, and started really with an emphasis on the male figure and then expanded to female figures. But you can see this shows you a lot of his pictorial strategy in this image of St. Nicholas of Myra, where it is a citation from a particular icon, which I'm going to show you in a moment. I wanted to let you look at it in detail so that you could see the catalog holding a page open to Raphael's Saint Cecilia, who is the patroness of music. And I can't tell you, all the absolute, would have to ask Kehinde Wiley himself about this, but certainly it might indicate that this young man was a musician, and that, of course, that would make her his patron as well. And the T-shirt has images of other African-American men, and it's actually a sign from a barbershop that's called the Bonafide Barbershop. Let me I'm not sure how well you can see that, but that bona fide is really wonderful. And that, I think, is a found image that he reproduces. And it's showing all the styles that were available for some very hip haircuts. But as we read those two elements that are very visible, if you know about this icon that's in Mount Athos and other versions of it, you see that Kehinde has posed this young man's body absolutely in the same way as the icon, makes him a little more full figure, but that gesture it's a different finger, which is interesting, but absolutely telling you, yes, I looked at this icon. So now what's that going to make us think of? Well, St. Nicholas of Myra has a very complex history. He is also, of course, St. Nicholas of Bari, which we might say more often here. That's where he was buried. And it's St. Nick that we all love as Santa Claus. And of course, I had to say Sinterklaas, taken by the Dutch to New York. It's one of the reasons why Santa has become so important in American culture. So again, we keep circling around all of these connections. But as I was trying to amplify my knowledge of St. Nicholas, particularly in that St. Nicholas of Myra moment, or Myra, I guess, that he, born in Asia Minor, participated in a council of Nicaea where Arianism was condemned. And that heresy is A-R-I-A-N, but in English it sounds exactly the same as Arianism, the fascist ideology. And I thought, I wonder if that was one of the reasons why Kehinde Wiley chose this particular saint, because he disputed Arian in that council, and in fact was imprisoned because he slapped him in the face. So I thought this is a wonderful detail to know from history that enriches what you can think about when you look at what Kehinde Wiley has done. And the background where he doesn't use gold leaf, but he uses a highly patterned background and has the figure coming in and out from behind it, in front of it. That is one of his pictorial strategies that's often used. And I'm going to refer to that again further on, but just to note it for the moment. Okay, let's look at another very vibrant contemporary artist, Shabalala Self. And she, I first saw her in an exhibition at PS1, connected to MoMA, right? And a group of artists in residence from the Studio Museum in Harlem were using that venue for the exhibition while that museum is being renovated, really rebuilt. It's supposed to open next October, I think, so it's been underway for a while. But she is originally from Harlem and started by giving life to many of the street scenes that were part of her environment and her heritage. And you can see I chose this triptych from a recent exhibition in Finland because, of course, that form of triptych comes from the Renaissance, and she uses it to amplify these different buildings that you might walk along if you're on 125th Street. No, she's on 145th Street. So it makes it very precise to refer to her environment. And the figure on the far left that now interacts with the dog that goes over to the person walking with it in the middle was originally just an individual painting, or at least that's the way it was exhibited at PS1. And when I saw it, of course, I immediately noticed that image on its shirt of the Raphael St. George. And that detail lets you see that she used an actual t-shirt in putting that together. So she uses materials quite often in connection, in addition to paints, but she sees herself, she calls them paintings, no matter what material she uses. And she says that these fragments that she puts together to make her figures often are memories or souvenirs. The material came from a certain friend, or she picked up this item somewhere along 125th Street, and so on and so forth. And the title Sup, by the way, is, kind of street slang for a greeting that you'd say, what's up, what's up, sup. You keep compacting it. So that's the, again, that reference to the contemporary world, to a particular environment, but with St. George featured proudly. And you'd think, is this saying that, is this a kind of armor with that gold frame? It almost looks like armor there, that you need to be vigilant in the city. Again, you can think of all sorts of things by interrogating that image, the detail of that along with the larger image. And I just want to quickly read something that the artist said. She said, "I'm not sure I was ever aware I was experiencing art history at the time, but a lot of my initial experiences with," and she puts in quotes, "art history, were just engaging with art while growing up in New York City. There are so many museums and art institutions in New York, it's nearly impossible not to interact with them. I remember visiting many as a child and teen on school trips with friends and family. The Met was really close to my elementary school, and I would visit often before heading home after school. Most of my first engagements with historical artworks were at the Met." And this, I think, is important because this is true of many American artists in particular, others as well, but particularly where you have Americans with all sorts of different ancestry, that both of these legacies are there, so often more than two. But she, of course, would be aware of specific heroes of African American art as part of her heritage, but that was also blended with her Western, art history that came through American institutions and American schools. I mean, most of these artists have gotten BFAs in different art programs. So they are very aware of both of these legacies. And often it's exactly that putting them together or having them question each other that makes for such exciting art. All right, and quickly, just to show you how pervasive this could be, I was delighted at one point when I came across these Dolce & Gabbana examples of Alta Moda and then Alta Sartoria from Spring Summer 2020, a couple more Leonardos to regale that. Runway was the Ambrosiana with the male figures there on the right. And I put them together with Shabalala Self's image, street fashion and high fashion, slight price differential there, but same thing happening at exactly the same moment. So again, once you open your eyes, there's lots of interesting details that come along. Okay, I must say that I'm enamored of this particular image made by Joyce Kozlov, another of the first generation feminists, and she is happily still working and still with us. I think originally from New Jersey, now for a long time in Brooklyn. And she was part of that first wave, as I say. She has worked in different styles. We're going to see a few things of hers, but here she takes this doorway or the enfilade of doorways, as you see from the Ducal Palace of Urbino, and reimagines them as the entrance to a subway station in Manhattan. And, I'm still looking for that station that leads you into that beautiful chiostro there with echt Renaissance perspective. I haven't found it yet. I'll let you know if I do. The exit is a little scary that you're coming out from that blue mist. So she's having a lot of fun. But notice not only has she given you a very precise rendering of the form of those doorways, but if you look at the fireplace there, you might just see that detail that her pattern around the exit is very close, kind of enlivened with color. But again, she's looking very closely at these models and engaging this dialogue. That independent line, they were all merged. There was the IRT, there was the IND. So this is also a little piece of history, but I don't think it ever exactly looked right that way. So we could wish. And she did the same sort of thing with the ideal cities that were connected to an artist at the court of Urbino. And she uses something very similar to say an art historian's joke, the Renaissance woman. So what's the joke? Well, did women have a Renaissance? Right, that was a very polemic publication in, I think, 74. And so here we have a kind of response to it, saying also lifting, of course, Botticelli's figures of women and putting them a completely different style. They're out of scale. They don't look like they are, in quotes, naturalistically or realistically painted. So that's the joke about were women part of this Renaissance, and she does it visually by combining different Renaissance styles. So once more, knowing that history gives you all kinds of paths for understanding what she was up to. Okay, and now this is a painting, a watercolor that I first saw last year in a fabulous exhibition called the Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism. That was at the Met, where the curator Denise Murrell showed the richness of art that was made during the Harlem Renaissance, and note the name, but also wanted to say it's in a larger context. There was a transatlantic connection, and many of these artists went and lived in Europe, and she traced a lot of that. But this was the painting that really caught my eye, because when I saw it, oh my goodness, he copied a Titian there. And that's not, by the way, in the catalog, although someone wrote a wonderful piece in the Atlantic following up the fact that, yes, that is Titian's Deposition. And the fact is it's toppled. So here, Aaron Douglas is quoting this, but he's upsetting it in every sense of that word. So here we get that, yes, I respect this. In fact, I study it, but I'm going to upset it a little bit in the art I make. And notice that that green plant isn't completely green. It looks, you know, and some of the leaves are a little dark. And so he is again playing with us. But then there's a very serious point that's made, because I've gotten you closer to that version of the Deposition. And notice that in the Titian, the figure who is on the right of the composition, he is an African European. And I know there was a conference here last weekend or the weekend before studying this matter. So here, I don't know if this came up, but this is another piece of it where Aaron Douglas saw that. And you can see that he emphasizes that that's a Black person helping to carry the body, whether it's Joseph of Arimathea as a reference. And the other figure who's carrying the body also has darker skin. Look at the arm in comparison to the figure of Christ. So Douglas emphasizes that in his version, again, to make a person of color visible in European art. And it's just a wonderful way to do it. I am coming to the final examples here. And of course, one has to mention artists who are working in new media, but still are thinking about the Renaissance. And of course, Cindy Sherman did this in a wonderful way. She decided that in her photographs, she could sort of step outside of her own personality and become figures inside of, let's put in quotes, old master paintings. And in the sick Bacchus, the Bacchino Malato, of course, there's a gender change as well. So she becomes not only the figure of Bacchus, but the figure of Caravaggio, pretending that he's the figure of Bacchus, in terms of a consensus that indeed that sick Bacchus was a self-portrait by Caravaggio at a very early moment. So she quite knowingly sets up the possibility of stepping into both of those roles. And with Botticelli's Judith with the Head of Holofernes, again, she uses all kinds of props and staging. She says that she went and got all of these fabrics from thrift shops and secondhand shops, but could light them in a way to make them look very sumptuous. And notice that in that Untitled 228, Judith is holding a head that looks like a no mask, right? The Japanese theater. And there was a type of old man and also demons had masks made for them. And I was wondering if this was something where she's, again, making cross-cultural references. The giant sword is changed into a tinier knife. And if you look down, the gorgeous, graceful figure of Botticelli painted of Judith, which, by the way, is in the Rijksmuseum. She has instead given those two splayed feet that are out of proportion and not gracefully posed. So once more, I think she is thinking about canons of beauty at the same time that she's thinking about the old masters. And indeed, she started doing this series of historical references of these photographs while she was living in Rome. But she has said that she made it a point not to seek out original works, but to look at them in photographs, so that she was also thinking about the way most people experience Renaissance art for her photographs. And then, of course, following in a very similar mode, but with slightly different, certainly with different emphases, Yasumazo Morimura has made really his whole career based on these embodiments, let's say, of historical art. So I went a little bit later into the 18th century because I thought his painting of Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun is so wonderful, and it does encapsulate in many ways further thoughts that he has about definitions of beauty, you know, how rigid the Western canon is about what's beautiful, although it does change through the centuries, but at any given moment. And he says, well, if a non-Western man can become a beautiful French woman, then we're talking about construction in what we consider beautiful. So he plays wonderful games that are serious games and making us think about that. And in fact, I think a very large part of his corpus sees him making this gender change, but at times he'll be an old master like Jan van Eyck, although if you look how carefully he studies these older works, but his mouth is open as opposed to the original portrait where he's rather tight-lipped, and maybe he wants to make Van Eyck talk through this, but not to get too frivolous. But the changes are important because they're not by chance. I'm sure everything is so meticulous. So that's an interesting thing to go back to the original and see what he's changed or tweaked and why he might want us to notice that. So if we move from photography to video, then we, of course, come to Bill Viola, who again passed last year, but was working in all kinds of explorations of really making these paintings of the past come alive, thinking about them in contemporary terms. And one of the things that he did, as I think most of us know, because he's done so much work that's been exhibited here in Florence. He studied here. It was a very important place for him. And Palazzo Strozzi had a fantastic exhibition some years back of this work. But he slows down all his videos so that you really think about emotions and sort of amplifies what Viola saw in the original works. That greeting after Pontormo is very well known. This emergence is perhaps less known, but an amazingly striking work, and based, of course, on Masolino's Pietà. And by the way, accents are missing. I should have apologized to the francophones for Elizabeth Vigée not having her proper accents. My computer sometimes cooperates and sometimes doesn't when I try to put accents in. At any rate, emergence in the Cristo in Pietà is a very haunting work. I want to thank everyone and just invite you to come and join us again.